in the end.
I had an urge to go back and replay this game after a horrible final boss that forced me to use Codebreaker on my actual PS2 left a very bad taste in my mouth. Which is sad because this game is one of the better action games for the PS2, even if it's brutally difficult. But first, some backstory. Overworks was a division of Sega AM R&D No. 1, and members of the team had developed the Shinobi series in the early days of the franchise. They wanted to bring the franchise into the era of 3D, but were unable to do so because of other projects, mainly Sakura Wars games that never made it outside of North America. By the time of the Dreamcast, though, Overworks member Noriyoshi Oba realized it was time for a new Shinobi game, with Sega at the publishing helm once again. Shinobi started development in May of 2001 with about 50 people at the helm. The game was originally planned for the Dreamcast, but with the console discontinued worldwide, the team had to shift it to a different 6th-gen platform. They ended up going with the PS2, as that was the first 6th-gen console the team got a hold of. They had experience with Sakura Wars games on the console, and it was the most popular system of the bunch. 3D was pretty much the norm by this point, but this forced Overworks to change the combat from ranged shuriken attacks to a more 3D hack and slash the final game would be. This is probably because a third-person ninja shooter with only shuriken doesn't exactly sound the most exciting, and if you don't believe me, try playing as a ninja in Ghost Squad on the Wii. You'll see what I mean soon enough. Therefore, more of the game's elements that took advantage of the 3D technology were born, and thus auto-targeting, swordplay, wall running, and stealth dashing, inspired by lead producer Takashi Uryu's knowledge of ninja abilities to divide themselves into different bodies, became a core part of the game's identity. Oba also wanted to make it a full-bore action game as opposed to a stealth game to set it apart from games like Tenchu. The game also adopted a darker hero compared to Joe Musashi of the original games, and an even darker tone, earning the game an M rating upon completion. Shinobi was showcased at E3 2002 along with other anticipated Sega titles, like Crazy Taxi 3, Toe Jam and Earl 3, and Panzer Dragoon Orda. Shinobi eventually released exclusively on the PS2 on November 12, 2002 for North America, December 5, 2002 for Japan, and May 15, 2003 for PAL territories. The game later got a digital re-release on the PSN for PS3 on March 7, 2012 for Europe, and August 14, 2012 for North America. Did this game bring Shinobi into the world of 3D successfully? Yes, but be ready for any agony that comes your way. Shinobi follows Hotsuma, a ninja raised in the Oboro clan, along with his older brother Moritsune. He had always considered Moritsune the superior fighter, but in an effort to determine the next clan leader in a fight to the death, Hotsuma reigned supreme after a 10-year training bout. Sound familiar? Yeah, there are some beats taken from Metal Gear Solid in the less superior brother winning, which itself was taken from the movie Gattaca. 4 years after that fateful night, an earthquake hits Tokyo, and a golden palace arises in the center of the city. Along with it, a sorcerer known as Hiroko. Someone thought to be long sealed by the clan. He summons creatures to cause trouble in the city with the clan in ruins. Ultimately, it's up to Hotsuma to stop Hiroko and avenge the fall of the Oboro. Many of the clan's members have been reanimated to serve Hiroko, and thus Hotsuma must free them as well. Shinobi is primarily a 3D action-adventure hack-and-slash game. You move through a linear set of levels from point A to point B. You'll encounter various enemies along the way, mainly the Hellspawn spawned in. You only have one sword, which you can use to slash at enemies as many times as it takes to kill them. You can hold square longer and charge the sword, then let go to strike an enemy. It uses yin from the slash gauge, more on that in a moment. Usually, you have to kill the enemies when you're blocked off from going on to the next area. You may also find occasional rocks that act as locks for the gates that need to be smashed. You can use shurikens to stun enemies so they can't block, single or launch a bunch at once, and you have a magic attack that wipes out all enemies near you in one blast. You can find these scrolls throughout the level, and you can only carry up to 3 at a time. They don't transfer from level to level though, but there is a fire and lightning ones, and one that grants invincibility for a little bit. In addition to combat, there's also platforming stuff. You can run on walls by jumping onto them, and you can stay on them until you jump off. You can also slice enemies in the air, then jump once more to keep a chain going, and you can also stealth dash both on the ground and in the air, useful for speeding through levels and going from enemy to enemy. You can also stealth dash after jumping to reach higher ledges. You'll use this quite a bit for platforming. You'll need to master this for the harder to reach areas, as some of them have coins. Collecting these coins unlocks bonuses. So everything I'm describing sounds like a simple action game, right? You're probably thinking, what makes this different from the other ones? How about you racing against the clock? In a way. After you beat the stage 1B boss, Aomizuchi, the sword Hotsuma uses, Okujiki, finally awakens after taking Aomizuchi's blood, and since Hotsuma owns it, well, he has to keep feeding it. He does this by continually taking down regular enemies and bosses, but it has to keep being fed, or else it will start draining Hotsuma's life and eventually kill him. This takes the game and makes the pace faster and more intense since you're on the run at this point to make it to the end of the level. To easily refill Akujiki's bloodlust, you will have to kill at least 4 enemies in a row in a short amount of time. This is what's known as a tate, and it will save your life when it comes to regular enemies and bosses. When you kill at least 4 enemies in a row in a given time, you'll get a short cutscene of the enemy stun, and you'll see Hotsuma sheath his sword in a cool way, all while the enemies get sliced and die. 4 is the bare minimum, but if you kill more, the sword becomes more powerful and tougher enemies can only take 1 or 2 hits to kill. You can tell how charged it is by the colors seen after attacking. Blue is low, purple is more charged, and Fuchsia is the max amount charged. It's another shade of purple, don't ask. Regardless of where the sword is charged, one tate will refill the slash gauge fully, which you will need to, well, keep the sword going, to keep your own life going, and, well, also filling it for the charge attack, since it does use a bit of yin here. You can also find red yin power-ups to refill it, though they're very few and far between. On top of that, the more powerful hits are especially helpful on bosses, where it can reduce them to very few hits. The bosses come at the end of the stages with some exceptions, and the strategy for them is pretty much the same. Slash the minions to charge the sword, then slice at the boss. What you slash and how you get the boss may differ slightly, but the idea is the same. This seems crazier, and it is, but once you get the hang of the game's mechanics, it can be pretty fun to pull off. Keep in mind, there are no checkpoints. Well, sort of. How the levels go are, you do the main portion, then when you reach the end of that, you get taken to the boss section. Do that, and the level ends. However, if you die in the first part of the level you're playing, you must replay that section from the start. Basically, no mid-level checkpoints. At least in the first section. If you make it to the boss and you die there, you just start from the boss portion of that stage. Some of these levels can be brutal with how many enemies they throw at you, and if you don't grasp the mechanics, you will struggle quite a bit. This makes Shinobi earn its status as one of the more difficult PS2 action games, but with the exception of the final boss, using the tools given to you and knowing when to use them will help a lot. In fact, if you know what you're doing, you can finish the game in 3 hours or so. First-time players may struggle more though. If you're curious why I said with the exception of the final boss, here's the quick version. The enemies you slice then have terrible hitboxes. Sometimes your sword will go through the talismans like they're ghosts. The first phase is pointless because they just introduce you to attacks that aren't too difficult to dodge, and you'll learn eventually. Invincibility frames on the boss when there wasn't any on any of the other bosses, not like here. And you can't hit him a second time if you miss the first, unlike other bosses, for the most part. Ultimately, the final boss is the worst kind of grind, and it's the reason why save states were invented, but everything else is fine for the most part. With an action game like this, controls are of the utmost importance, and the game succeeds well in this regard. There's no input delay, which is very crucial in a game like this. Action buttons work as they should, are responsive, and are simple to understand and execute. Y-axis camera control, though, is always inverted, and there's no way to change it, even though X-axis isn't, and you can actually remap the individual buttons. The camera itself, though, is a bit too slow for my taste. Like, it sometimes stays focused on the air or on the ground depending on where you adjusted it. You can always reset it at least, so I guess that helps. Graphics are also pretty good for the time. A lot of the character designs are pretty cool and still look awesome to this day, especially Hotsuma himself. Fun fact, the red scarf he has was implemented when the team started fooling around with parameters, and they put it to 200% to make it flow when he ran. It actually does make it easier to keep track of him, since if you lose sight, you can just follow the scarf when in action, and it just plain looks cool when he's running and dashing and everything. Models aren't as sharp as the generic enemies, but the designs of them do offset this. Though some environment textures are a bit repetitive, it's not so much a big deal as long as you don't die a heck of a whole lot, which is easier said than done. The designs of the environments are also good, and there is a decent amount of variety in them. In general, the game's aesthetics are very pleasing to look at, and while it's not quite pushing the PS2 to its absolute limits, everything from the character models and everything else mentioned does help give Shinobi a memorable look. The sound is one of the best parts of Shinobi. The music in particular is an excellent soundtrack. I'd go so far as to say it's one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time. The soundtrack mixes several different genres. It mostly mixes traditional Japanese music and combines it with techno and combines it as well with rock. So you've got two different combinations, but it all sounds so well. It also flows well, is blended in a way that sounds pleasing to the ears, balances which parts to use, and switches between them efficiently and in a way without sounding disrupting, and it all just sounds cool. You're gonna get several of the songs stuck in your head by the end of it all. My favorites on the OST are Cool Corporation, Waiting Place, Strange Device, and Call, the final boss theme, even though the sound effects are also pretty on point and fit the game well. The sword slashes, sound effects heard in tates, stealth dashing, and even the menu sound effects are on point. Special mention to the sound creator of the game, that being Sega legend Yutaka Minobe. He's done a lot of other sound work on other Sega games, and he brought his A game here. The voice acting is fine. You have options for both English and Japanese. Both options sound fine and get the job done well, though the English voice acting does have some awkward acting, but this is very few and far between, and it does work well for the most part. There are even a few recognizable actors in the English dub. Roger L. Jackson, aka Ghostface from Scream, and Mojo Jojo from the Powerpuff Girls voices old Hiruko, and in the additional voices cast, Terry McGovern, the voice of Launchpad McQuack from DuckTales and Darkwing Duck, and Charles Martinet, Mario himself. Oddly enough, some actors aren't credited in the English dub at all for their characters. Kobushi, Kongo, Hakuraku, Homura, Kizami, Akagane, Shirogane, the reporter, Young Hotsuma, and Kurakuuda / Genin don't have their English voice actors listed in the credits. Though I bet Homura was probably voiced by Vic Mignogna, since it sounded an awful lot like him to my ears. But I can neither confirm nor deny, so someone please help. Replayability is pretty good. As I mentioned before, you can go back and collect missing coins, at least once you beat the stage. Every 10 coins unlocks a new feature, including new characters such as Moritsune, and even the original Shinobi protagonist Joe Musashi. There's also bonus missions to unlock, and beating the game unlocks higher difficulty options if the main game isn't hard enough for you. Shinobi is a tough but damn well made action game. It looks well, sounds well, controls well, has plenty of extra content to keep you coming back, and once you master it, it can be rewarding to beat, seeing as how it is one of the tougher PS2 action games with its race to the finish ordeal. However, the difficulty goes too far on the final boss. There are no checkpoints, there's no mid-level checkpoints, except for when you get to the end part of a stage. And the camera can be a bit of a pain at times, and the difficulty itself can be off-putting to some. But for those who want a tough challenge, this is definitely the game for you. It's very rewarding to master and just a hell of a time. The game is currently sitting in the $15 range for CIB copies in North America and closer to $20 for PAL copies. I think it's worth it at that price. I give Shinobi a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching. If you like what you saw, click the big red button below to subscribe. Check out the other links in the description for more cool stuff, and check out the playlist on screen for more content. See you in the next video.